I'm Brian Fehrman, and this is David Fletcher, both from Black Hills Information Security. And today we're going to talk about ELD Device Security, which, as Dakota has just pointed out, is redundant. It's like PIN number, but we're just going to go with it. All right, so first we're going to talk a little bit about why do we care about this. So when it comes to trucks, we can argue that these are possibly part of critical infrastructure in the United States. Over 63% of all of the freight in the US is moved by trucks in one way, shape, or form. This includes things like groceries. Can you guys hear me okay? I feel like I'm really muted out by the other people. My voice is low. You can hear it good over there? Okay, and over there? Okay, it's weird, all I can hear is these people, so just, all right. Get a little deeper. All right, so things like groceries, fuel, medical supplies, manufacturing components, basically anything you can think of is likely shipped by a truck. So with this, nearly all trucks now are federally mandated to have what are called ELDs, electronic logging devices. We're going to talk more about those a little bit later, but the important thing to note is that almost every single truck has to have one of these devices. And now these ELDs, these devices, actually tie into what I call the nervous system of the truck. So again, we have trucks that are part of our critical infrastructure. They're federally mandated to have these devices, and these devices plug right into the nervous system of the trucks. So you can start thinking about some of the implications of that and the implications it can have on our infrastructure. Now, just to give a little outline of what we're going to talk about, we'll give you guys an overview of ELDs, kind of what they are, a background, and some of the regulations surrounding them. We'll also give you a background of security on them, so basically a state-of-the-art, what's been done before, where's security at in terms of these devices. Go over some of the different potential attack vectors, what are some of the ways that people can go about trying to compromise these devices, and we'll go through what our general methodology was for testing the devices as well as what we did for the research on these devices. So who are we? We're security analysts, researchers, however you'd like to call us for BHIS. We have degrees and certificates and all those things which you guys probably don't care about, but you can just fill in the blanks there. Hardware hacking enthusiasts. We're not afraid to touch a soldering iron. We're not afraid to let out the magic smoke. We're very much into embedded things. So what is an ELD? Electronic logging device. All right, talk done. No. Basically, what it is this is what truckers used to do and what some still do is they would drive, and after they drive, they would manually write down the hours that they've worked. So they write down the hours that they've driven, they write down the hours that they've rested, and this is for compliance reasons. But if you know a trucker, you know you're in a company that has trucking, what you probably know is that a lot of them will keep two different sets of logs. They'll keep the log book that when they go to, say, a weigh station or they get pulled over and someone's like, hey, I want to see your records to make sure that you're in compliance with regulations, they'll pull this one out and they'll say, oh, okay, good, everything's great. But then they have another log book that is their actual hours that they worked. This is just something that's common. I'm not saying that everyone does it, but this is something that is pretty common. And so cooperation of government and some lobbyists put some rules into place that now say you can't really do that anymore. Instead, you have to have these devices that will automatically record your hours that you've worked and as well as your hours that you've rested to make sure that people are getting the appropriate amount of rest. And it is important. We don't want drivers to get exhausted because if they do, we have these huge vehicles and yeah, we have safety concerns. So there are some benefits to it. And this is something that was federally mandated. It came out December 18th, 2017, so a little bit less than a year ago. So this is something that's pretty new. There are some exceptions to the regulations of the ELDs, which we'll talk about quickly here. Now, one of the weird ones is that vehicles older than model year 2000 don't have to have an ELD. There are a couple of reasons for this. One of them could be compatibility, is probably the main reason. But what comes out of this, which is kind of weird, what people are starting to do is they'll get engines from an old vehicle and then put them into a newer vehicle. So that way they have the amenities of, modern amenities, they have comfort and everything, but yet they have this older engine and so they don't have to follow compliance. You put these loopholes into place, people are going to exploit them. Another one is that people who use RODs, which is records of duty status, which is basically their logbook, if they use paper RODs, as long as you do it less than 8 days in a 30-day period, then you don't have to have one of these devices either. People who have what are called tow-away operations, which could literally be towing, it also relates to the transporting of cars. So if you have a business that's what you do, deliver cars, you're possibly exempt. As well as agricultural vehicles, they don't have to worry about it either. So some of the data requirements for ELDs is the data has to be transferred off of the device in basically one of two ways. They call it either telematic or local. Telematic, this is typically going to be something that transfers out via some kind of cell service, and it could be direct to some kind of a server, or it could be indirect through some kind of email sending. The other way that they could do it is locally through either Bluetooth or USB. So basically after the driver has done their route, they take the device out, they plug it into something else, it uploads the data, and they can check everything out. Now, one of the other things that's required with these, though, is that they have to have some kind of a display or some kind of a printout, meaning that if someone wants to see the logs, so they go to a weigh station, someone says, hey, I want to see your data, there has to be a way for them to plug into it and get the record, or to look at the device directly and see exactly what's going on. One of the other main ones is that there has to be a limited ability for people to be able to edit their data, so that truckers can't just go in, modify their logs, and kind of get around the regulations. They can go in and modify them to some extent, but the original records must be kept in place. So let's talk about the security requirements. There's really nothing. If you go and look, there are really no regulations in terms of the kind of security that these devices have to have. There's a little bit around TLS in terms of the way that the data is transferred from the devices, but the devices themselves, there's really nothing that they have to follow. So let's get into how are these devices certified. So you're a manufacturer and you want to get into the ELD industry, and you're wondering, how do I get my device certified on the site? Well, you follow step 1 4 different times, according to the slide. Somehow my bullet points didn't work out. But no. So here's the steps. You go on, you request a user account, you go on to the government website, you get signed up with a user account, you register your ELD, just providing some information they ask about, and then this is the great one. You self-certify that your device meets any regulations that are in place. I kid you not, you give it your own stamp of approval. So you might think I'm kidding, but I took this literally off of their website. That is step 4 off of the government website, is that you self-certify and tell them that your device is certified. So let's think about that. There are these devices that are mandated to be in vehicles, in trucking vehicles. There are basically no security requirements, and companies are allowed to self-certify. It's kind of a recipe for a lot of issues to pop up. So that's kind of a background of ELDs, requirements and everything. Now we're going to get into how do these devices work. Well, most of them are going to connect into the CAN bus of the system via J1939 9-pin port. Some of you have probably seen this, but on most trucks, the one on the left is likely going to be what it plugs into. Others are going to connect via OBD2 port, most likely. So if you go out in most of your cars, if you look, it's typically around the passenger side, left side of passenger side. You'll probably see one of these ports. I have one car where it's green. It might be different colors, but you'll see that on some vehicles. And the way that most of these ELD devices work is by reading the CAN messages on the CAN bus. Now, I've talked about CAN a couple times. What is this? It's basically just the communication bus between the different components in a vehicle. So it's the way that all the little computers in your vehicle communicate with one another is across this CAN bus. Now, the ELDs collect the data off of the CAN bus, and then they'll use that for telemetry information, other information about the vehicle. Typically, this will also be used in conjunction with some kind of GPS device that is on the ELD. So that way, they'll take the GPS information, the CAN information, mold those together, and give a clear picture of the movement of the truck. And again, the data that's collected is transferred off either telematically, so probably via cell, or locally via USB or Bluetooth or something like that. Now, what are the vendors' claims when it comes to security? So I'm going to be honest, some of these memes I've never seen before, and I'm always a little bit nervous that there might be something like underlined with them. So if I see any shocked faces, I'll know not to use those ones again. But all right, so here's what some of the vendors' claims. The first bullet point here, in my opinion, is probably the biggest one, which is that ELDs are designed to only read data, meaning that they're not supposed to be able to send messages onto the CAN bus. Why is that important? Because certain CAN messages can affect the acceleration and braking of vehicles. When you think about cruise control, with the way that the cruise control will work on a lot of vehicles is through CAN messages from different devices on the CAN bus. That's how it's able to tell how fast it's going, you know, if it needs to slow down, speed up, any of that. So if you're able to inject messages, you can possibly control the acceleration and braking of the vehicle. So now think about that. You've got a semi that's traveling 70 miles an hour down the interstate, and now suddenly someone's able to lock up the brakes or disable the brakes or something like that. It's terrifying. And so that's why this first bullet point, in my opinion, is probably one of the biggest things that they need to worry about when it comes to the security aspect of ELDs. They also claim that the data is encrypted, both at rest, both in transmission. They also say that they anonymize driver information, meaning that if you're able to pull off any of this data, you shouldn't be able to tie that back to any single person as someone who's outside of the company. So as an attacker, you shouldn't be able to correlate that with anybody. One of the coolest claims that I saw, and I'll read some quotes here, is some of the vendors claim to have eliminated the risk of hacking, which we've seen other companies say before too. Security is solved, problem done, we can all go home and we've lost our jobs. No, and here's some of the, whoops, I'm sorry, one of the quotes I'll read here. Encryption and data obfuscation are two of the most effective ways the company is implementing cybersecurity measures. Quote, these two measures ensure data is transmitted in a binary format and sent separately from the encryption keys, so there is no way to decipher what the data shows, even if it isn't encrypted. And it gets even better. This company has multiple layers of security and eliminate the risk of hacking, providing peace of mind that electronic logs, the truck engines, brakes, etc. cannot be accessed remotely through the in-cab devices or systems. The only reason I point that out and worry is I just feel it's that kind of arrogance that gets a lot of companies in trouble, to just be like, yeah, we're unhackable. Like, no, you guys need to dig a little bit deeper. So what's some of the prior work in ELD when it comes to ELD security? There actually isn't a lot out there. Like I said, this is fairly new. The regulation is less than a year old, and so there hasn't been a lot of work done on this. There's University of Michigan, 2016, which I'm sure David's a Michigan guy, and we've got Sally out there, Michigan as well. yeah, all right. The work wasn't related directly to ELD, but what they did focus on was accessing and controlling the vehicle via that J1939 port that I talked about earlier. And they found that they could, in fact, control both acceleration and braking of the vehicle. Now, this had to be done with physical access to the device, at least, or physical access to the vehicle, at least initially. But you know, if you can get your device on there, you can potentially control it remotely. But the big thing there is they found that they were able to control acceleration and braking through the CAN bus. The other main one that I found was from IOActive. They actually gave a presentation last year, Black Hat 2017, where they looked at the ELDs specifically. And mainly they looked at the firmware of the devices and looked at the protocols of the devices, and found that in general they didn't see a whole lot of security going on with these devices. And with here, they were able to make at least one of the ELD devices send CAN messages. So go back to a couple slides before where I mentioned the vendor claims. They said that they don't do that. Well, it turns out that they do that. And
what's stopping them from doing that?
So what's stopping them from doing that? Thank you, David. That's an excellent question. So here's the thing with the CAN communication. The way that the protocol is set up is effectively, if you can read messages off of the CAN bus, you should be able to send messages on the CAN bus at the hardware level. That means to disable it, it has to be done at the software level, meaning that you're a malicious firmware update away from being able to send CAN messages from the device. So what are some of the potential attack vectors? We have things like going through the vendor or third-party service systems, and what I mean is that you have these ELDs, they communicate back to some server to send the data out, and so one potential attack vector would be to see, is the reverse true? So the devices can communicate to a server, can the server communicate to the devices? Now obviously this is something that we did not test because we don't have permission and we try not to commit felonies. Try not to commit felonies. The next would be through mobile applications. So a lot of these ELDs have some kind of a mobile application that pairs with them. And so a couple attack vectors there would be to either compromise the phone and use that to leapfrog over to the device, maybe via Bluetooth or Wi-Fi or something like that, or also to go at the application level, where maybe you weaponize a version of the application, you put it out, try to entice people that, hey, this is the legitimate one, you should download this, and now you've got control that way. Another potential attack vector is through wireless. So we talked about that they have wireless protocols usually, whether Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and other things of that nature. Other one would be physical access. So if you can get physical access to the device, you can start playing around with it, possibly do some stuff through that avenue. Now, just to go over our general methodology, I'm going to drill into each of these bullet points a little bit more, but just wanted to give a quick run through. So you can see we've got a recon phase like we do with most testing, a passive analysis. We start looking at the external side of the device, we start looking at the wireless side of the device, and then look at the internal side of the device. And so for the reconnaissance, again, I've got a couple main bullet points. I'll drill into these a little bit more, but just a quick overview. We have a website that we really like called fccid.io. Going to look at the data sheets for the components, looking at the vendor sites for the companies that manufacture these devices, as well as just using good old-fashioned search engines. Now, fccid.io is a fantastic site. If you're going to be doing any kind of hardware hacking whatsoever, you should probably become familiar with this site. The reason is that if your device has any kind of wireless component, it almost certainly has an FCC ID associated with it. Because if it's going to be transmitting information, that FCC wants to know what is it transmitting, what's the frequency, what's the power, and they want to make sure that it is in compliance with their regulations. And so it will likely have some kind of an ID associated with it. This website is basically a search engine for those IDs. And you can go on there, you enter in the IDs. Typically the IDs are going to be right on the outside of the device. So you can see them, you can pick up the device and it'll just say FCC ID. You go search and you can find awesome things like board pictures. So pictures of the actual circuit boards themselves. And so sometimes you don't even need to tear open the device to know what's going on inside on the circuit board. Now there is a caveat though. It's not always going to be the device, the actual device itself that you pull up on this site. You have to keep in mind that these IDs are specific to the wireless component of the device. You might get lucky and it might be the entire device. This might be basically the only device that has this wireless component, but you might find another device as well, which we'll see a little bit later. You can also find things like user manuals, which will tell you protocol information, how to communicate with those protocols, possible places to find applications for it, lots and lots of good stuff on this site. Datasheet. So when it comes to electronic components, virtually every component that's out there, you're going to be able to find a datasheet for it. These are important because they'll tell you the pinouts of the components. They'll tell you so you know which pins are which are really important, so you don't flip your power and your ground, things like that. They'll tell you the different interfaces that might be available on these devices. So if you see a microcontroller on there, you can figure out what kind of, does it have CAN, does it have UART, does it have JTAG? And kind of get an idea of what's on this before you spend too much time playing around with it. Another important thing that I put on here, voltage information. You need to know, is it 3 volt, 5 volts, 12 volts? You don't want to be putting 12 volt to 3 volt. It'll let out the smoke. Vendor sites, sometimes just going to their sites, you can find a lot of useful information, user manuals that they put out, which again, like I mentioned before, you can find things, protocol information, and how to kind of use the device, interface with the device. You can potentially find applications associated with the device. So you can download these applications from their site, you can decompile them, try to reverse engineer them, and probably get a lot of good information from them. Sometimes the devices will have logins, so you can see are there any kind of default credentials that you can potentially use with these devices, save you a little bit of time. And then I also put on here forums. The reason I put this on here is that you might find forums where users have basically they're asking about some kind of a bug that they found or some kind of an other issue. Well, that bug could be exploitable. They could be like, hey, I'm having such and such problem, how do I fix this? And you can look at that and be like, oh, hey, I don't know how to fix it, but I know how to leverage it. And you might find something cool. So, you guys can see that one. All right. Oh, is this me? All right, we'll try it again. So search engines as well, tried and true, so basically just searching around for the devices. One of the big things that I would recommend just with hardware hacking in general, before you get too far into it, is just see, has anyone hacked this before? There's nothing quite as soul-crushing as spending a ton of work on something, thinking you found something awesome, you're getting ready to publish your research, and then you find that somebody did it 3 years ago. I can tell you from experience. So you can save yourself a lot of time by just seeing, has somebody else done this work? And similarly, on that note is, so you have your device, there's certain components on it. Try to see, are these components used in some other piece of hardware? Maybe somebody hasn't done research on your device specifically, but maybe they've done research on a device that has the same components. And so you can use the same tricks and techniques on your device as they did on their device, save you a little bit of time. And the other one there, similar to the forums, is are there any forums outside of the vendor sites that people have posted bugs or other issues that you might be able to exploit? So moving on to the passive analysis portion of this, so we're moving on from recon to the passive analysis. What I mean by this is you've got your lab, you set up a CAN bus system, and you plug your device into your ELD device, sorry, I'm redundant, you plug your ELD into the system and just watch for signals. Now, I've mentioned it a couple times now. In my opinion, one of the biggest concerns is whether or not these devices are transmitting by default or able to transmit by default. If you plug that device in and you see anything going on the bus, that is a problem. That is a huge problem. That vendor needs to know right away, and they need to fix that. So just plug it in, watch for any kind of signals. I put up some devices here that you can potentially use. These are just a couple we picked out. We have no relation with these companies. I'm not trying to promote them, but just some different devices in case you're wondering what can you use. Canalize, Machina, CAN shields for like Arduino, Raspberry Pi, those kinds of things. So moving from the passive analysis to kind of interacting with the device a little bit more. Some of these devices have USB ports, others will have like a DB9 serial port. So just plugging into these, plugging into that serial port, plugging the USB from USB onto your computer to see does anything pop up. If something pops up, connect to it. You'll never know what you find. What? All right. Next. Wireless analysis. So I mentioned all these protocols already. A lot of these devices will have at least one of these, if not multiples of these. I think we have at least one device that had 3, if not all 4 of these. But there's other things you can look at. We didn't spend a ton of time on the wireless aspect of this, just with the time constraints we had, but another potential avenue we can look at. So now we're moving more towards the board level here with the internal interface analysis. The 3 things that we'll typically look for when we're doing hardware hacking, we're at the board level, is we're trying to find 2 main protocols. One is UART interfaces. So what is UART? That's basically your serial communication. If you've ever played with a Raspberry Pi or Arduino or any of that, I'm sure you've done things with UART, with serial. Same thing. It's easy. Once you find it, it's easy to read the traffic. You can possibly inject traffic. And so that's one of the things we'll look for. The next is the JTAG interfaces. So JTAG, this can be used for a couple different purposes. One is you could use it to try to dump the program from the device onto some other machine so that you can inspect it using binwalk files, strings, and other programs that you can use for looking at binary files and memory. And you might find some really good stuff there. The other thing that JTAG might provide for you, if you can find it and it's set up still, is that you can actually use this on some devices to debug the device in real time. So you plug into the JTAG, you boot up the device, and you could actually use something like GDB, where you're walking through line by line of code execution. You can see what's loaded into memory, and you can get a pretty good idea of what's going on and try to reverse engineer the device in that manner. The other thing that we'll look for are flash memory chips of some sort. Most devices have these on there somewhere. And usually they'll have whatever program is being run on the microcontroller will typically be stored on the flash chip. Now, it could be in both places, it typically is. And the reason for this, one of the reasons for this is in case anything goes wrong with the main program, you have a way to restore it back to the original state. So think about when you do factory reset on devices, typically what's happening is it's pulling that program off of some kind of a flash chip, reloading it, and you're back to where you were. You don't have to worry about anything and you're off and running. So that's something that we're definitely interested in trying to find. Now, just to talk a little bit about, grab some water. Just talk a little bit about what we actually did here. We just kind of semi-randomly ordered some ELDs online. We just went out, we picked some, and ordered them up and just played around with them. Doing the assessments that I mentioned, kind of walking through the different steps there. We definitely stayed away from testing the external assets. So as I mentioned earlier, we did not communicate with any of the servers. We stayed away from all that because, again, we don't want to commit felonies. We redacted out the vendor names here. We're going to refer to these devices generically. We don't want to pick on people. We don't want to piss people off. We don't want to point at a vendor and be like, they suck, because we don't want any, but we're not trying to do that. We just want to give an overview of ELDs in general. And we only did 5 devices here. I think there are 70, 80 or so that are registered.
77, something.
Yeah, 77 that are registered. So are the ones that we have representative of all ELDs? Not necessarily. But these are just the ones that we played around with.
And it's worth mentioning that only one device in the year and a half that they've been in use has been revoked. And it was self-revoked by the organization that makes it.
So going on, we'll start with device 1 here. Basically here the FCC ID, some of the FCC ID IO results. These aren't really too useful, but I just wanted to give you guys an idea for people who haven't seen the site before of some of the information that you can find out there. So here we've got Bluetooth. It has some kind of Bluetooth device on there. It shows the frequency ranges. This can be pretty helpful if you have other devices that are maybe on a non-standard protocol, but they're still transmitting out, and you have something like a HackRF or some other SDR. You're trying to capture the wireless traffic, and you want to narrow it down to a specific band. This can save you quite a bit of time, knowing what frequency they're transmitting on. So the search also gave board images. In full disclosure, from the images, I couldn't tell what these chips were. I labeled these after taking the device apart and using the really nerdy magnifying headset thing. Yeah, those things are great. But anyways, it still did give this general picture. So you can see up top, right away, that's probably some kind of a flash chip, which it was. You can see the microprocessor, STM32F, which is pretty common. Down at the bottom there, it shows in the picture a 8-pin header. So on the board itself, that header wasn't present. It was, or at least the pins weren't present, and had the holes. So it had 8 holes, but didn't have the pins just ready to go. But looking at that, I would think that's potentially a programming interface, potentially JTAG. Next, on the flip side of the board, up on the top there, they actually had pinouts that were labeled RXTX, which is pretty uncommon. I typically don't see that unless it's on really old boards. They seem to used to label them on older boards, everything that you want to know. This one, though, had them labeled, so it might be an easy win. And then down there, just showing it, that's the actual chip that handles the CAN communication. So plugging the device in, I didn't see anything come across the wire. That's good. Biggest concern gone there, at least initially. One of the things, though, that was interesting about this was that the device was perpetually in pairing mode. So it had Bluetooth, and it was always in pairing mode. You start it up, it's ready to pair. You pair to it, it's ready to pair. It did need a pin, but still, it's always ready to be paired. And the concerning part is that the vendor put out an application, you download it to your phone, and you can actually use that to update the firmware of the device via Bluetooth. So the device is always in pairing mode, and you can update the firmware over Bluetooth. A little bit concerning. So the first thing I jumped for were those pads that were labeled RX and TX, because it's like, oh, awesome, easy win. I'm going to call it an early day. But nothing. So one of the devices that we use a lot for hardware hacking is called the JTAGulator. If you guys have never used the JTAGulator, we have labs that are set up for using the JTAGulator, and I highly suggest going and playing around with it. It is an amazing piece of equipment. Created by a guy named Joe Grand, super smart guy, super nice guy. I don't know if he's here. Sure. If he is, hi Joe. But super awesome guy. So anyways, we hooked this device up to try to detect, is there any UART in place? Nothing. Does it even show a state change on the pins? Are they flipping from 0 to 1? Is anything going on? Nothing. Rough. So moving on, I was like, well, I'm going to go ahead and solder up to that 8-pin interface. There has to be something here. Solder up, nothing. No UART, no JTAG, no activity whatsoever. So desoldered that flash chip, the one flash chip I pointed at, desoldered it, used the Shikra to dump the memory, which is another lab that we have out there. I just want to go ahead and advertise those. Rick put together a fantastic lab for this, so definitely go out and play with it if you get a chance to. But after dumping off everything from flash, Nothing. There's basically nothing there. There were, I mean, a couple strings that were, I mean, pretty much worthless. There was nothing. So pretty discouraging so far, besides the Bluetooth aspect of it, but got to keep going. So on to the next device. With this one, there wasn't really much on the FCCID.io site. One thing that I found that was interesting, though, was it was labeled as, this is an instance where the component that came up was not actually part of the device that we were testing. It was part of something else. And the device that it was part of was labeled as wearable GPS wristband with cellular functionality. And looking at this thing, I'm like, how in the heck do you put this thing on a wristband? Because this thing is like good size. I'll show you. It looks a lot like that on the left. And the first thing that popped into my mind is it's like a freaking Nintendo Power Glove thing that, like, you strap on and you're like, yeah, all right, I'm ready to rock. We're going to do this. So the actual component is that U-Blocks little piece up there. And we found that that was actually in a couple of the devices that we tested, I think. Yeah. So that's what popped up on the FCCID.io site. Now, looking at the board itself, this device actually had two boards that were connected together. This board on this side, you can see where you would stick in a SIM card, and then to the left of that was this 4-pin header. Most of the time, if there's going to be something on a 4-pin header on a board, it's likely going to be UART. But we hooked up to it, and nothing. You're going to find a common theme with this. Nothing. So flipping it over on the other side, we have this 6-pin interface down on the left, and I'm kind of drooling at this point because I'm like, all right, easy win. JTAG, hook it up. Absolutely nothing. So likely what happens with these interfaces is that they do serve a purpose during production, during assembly, during testing. They have a purpose. They're not just there. But what will happen a lot of times is these will get disabled when the board gets sent out. They can be disabled in a couple of ways. They can remove components from the board, so they're just physically not connected. They can also do what's called blowing a fuse, so they can send out a signal to the microprocessor that will actually completely disable that interface. You're out of luck. You can't really get back to it at that point. But looking next to it is the header that connects the two boards together. So hook up the JTAGulator, and finally something. And what I found was that it was likely the communication between the microcontroller and the cellular unit. So I used the JTAGulator to identify the parameters, and by that I mean to find out which pins are RX and TX, and what is the baud rate, what speed is this transmitting, at what speed is this transmitting. And I looked at this output during device boot. One thing I want to note here is that if you're playing around with devices and you're trying to look for something like UART, it's good to do it at multiple stages during the device boot process. It's good to do it right when the device boots up, shortly after the device boots up, and at steady state too. I gave a talk a couple years ago on device hacking, and I had done this a bunch of times with a particular device, finding UART on it. It worked right before I went to the talk. I get to the talk, I'm doing a live demo, and I go to find it, and nothing. And then nothing, and then nothing. And I'm like basically sweating at this point. And then finally, I found that it was because I was just, for whatever reason during the talk, just missing the spot where I needed to be. And then finally it hit, and everyone clapped, and we all cheered, and a huge sigh of relief. But yeah. So just to note, and just kind of with hardware in general, you just got to be persistent, be patient, and it can be frustrating, but you just got to keep trying. So what I found on this bus essentially were what are called AT commands, which are typically used. It's basically the communication with cellular. Oh, that someone said something. Basically, communicating to some kind of a cellular device, you'll usually see these what are called AT commands. But the more interesting part of what I saw here were web endpoints. And so I've got them redacted here, but I had two web addresses. So these servers, these endpoints are somehow tied into this device. This device is communicating back to these endpoints at some point in the device lifecycle. So I visited these. Again, I just want to make this entirely clear here. All I did was go to the websites. There's nothing wrong with that. They have the websites out there. I'm not It's there for people to visit. So I went to the full URL because there were two URLs there, one with a subdomain, one that was just top level, and found just a default IIS web page, which was kind of interesting. And so I go up to the top level domain and find that it was for a fleet management company. And so if I were evil, I would definitely want to be looking into those endpoints at that point, because you want to see, again, these devices are communicating to the servers. Can you do the reverse? Can you communicate from the servers to the device? If you can, then you have a possible remote attack vector. So next, desoldered and dumped the flash off the device. There was no file system here. And the strings that we were able to pull out of the memory were actually just the same strings that I saw in those AT commands. So I was able to find the web interfaces, the web endpoints, but they were the ones that I already saw. So it wasn't, we didn't get too much else from it. So the last device that I played around with, device number 3, this had 3 of the 4 protocols. So we had GPS, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi on them. This was another one where the Bluetooth was perpetually in pairing mode all the time, and it was another one where you could update the firmware over Bluetooth through an application that of which they provided. We're not going to worry about that. All right, so the other thing that we found was that the device broadcasted out, you could communicate to it via Wi-Fi. And for this device, once you wanted to register it or activate it, you needed to go to their website and you needed to enter in a MAC address for your device. Now, it's not entirely clear to which component this MAC address belonged, if it was the Wi-Fi component itself or something else at the board level, something else you wouldn't be able to see just by doing some kind of a Wi-Fi sniffing. But regardless, this was actually broadcasted as part of the SSID. And I don't mean that you set up a wireless sniffer and you see the MAC address of what's transmitting or what's broadcasting. It was literally part of the SSID that was there. So you have this piece of information that helps to uniquely identify and register the device to somebody that is just broadcast to anybody who is within range of it. So all I found on this device, really wasn't much. It was just a 5-pin header that was labeled as Prague, which again, when I saw it, I was like, oh, this is fantastic. I never find things that are labeled anymore. We're going to call it an easy day again, or call it an early day. But no, absolutely nothing, except for in terms of the JTAG or UART interfaces. But we did see some state changes. However, in the time that we were working on this, we couldn't quite determine what the protocols were. We couldn't decode them. And by the end of it, it actually wasn't spitting out anything. So yeah, it's just the way that it goes. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to David to talk about his devices.
So in addition to in contrast to the first 3 devices that we took a look at, we have this device here. And if anybody can tell, looking at it, Brian's devices had like 4 or 5 pins exposed, maybe 1 or 2 headers. This had a total of 65 pins that you could actually solder devices to. And like a couple of Brian's devices, we had pretty much 0 to go on with FCCID.io. When we visited FCCID.io, all we had was the wireless chip on the bottom left-hand side. That's it. So it was pretty much hitting the thing blind. So we ended up soldering a ton of leads to this device. It had GPS, USB, micro SD, Bluetooth. There was no documented purpose for the micro SD card. It really resembled a development board that was put into production. And again, Bluetooth was always in pairing mode. And what we ended up doing is finding JTAG on the 20-pin edge connector. And another weird thing about this particular device is it had 3 momentary switches on it. So I was thinking maybe we had to push buttons in a particular sequence or hold them all down at the same time to be able to get state changes on the other pins. So all of the other pins were completely static. I had no changing I/O on any of those outputs, just this one edge JTAG connector. So we started soldering up to all of these interfaces and looked at each of those exposed pins as we were playing with the switches. And after soldering 65 exposed test points, out goes the magic smoke. What ended up happening is we were manipulating the board and there were wires everywhere. And one actually ended up hitting the 12-volt rail on a breadboard and frying the main processor. We did desolder the BGA flash, but if you've ever looked at that interface, you have a number of address lines. It's not serial communication like you would dump from a regular SOIC flash chip, but it did appear to be the most promising target we had, because this was another device where the manufacturer actually advertised, hey, when you want to update the firmware to this thing, you got to go into the mobile app, request the firmware update, and then push it to the device either over Bluetooth or over USB. So that's a nice opportunity to maybe grab that firmware before it hits the device using a rooted Android device. So that really didn't get us much anywhere. The next device that we had was very similar to the first three devices that we looked at. Very few headers exposed, but it did have Bluetooth, cellular. If you can see it, right in the middle, there's three little boxes. Those are 6-pin and 4-pin headers that were so tiny that we both tried to solder up to them, and there was just no doing it. We were going to destroy the board if we actually tried it more than we already had. So we really had these four pins on the left, and then there's 3 pins on the other side of the device in addition to the cellular modem that's attached. We found nothing on the JTAG and UART headers, or in the way of JTAG and UART. And we really didn't explore those small headers because we just didn't have the tooling to do so. And we really didn't have the time to get them by the time we got to the point that we needed to look at them. One thing that's interesting, though, is that last ELD had a USB interface. And when you plug your USB interface into a Linux box, it registered 5 serial devices. So I could talk directly to the SIMCOM cellular modem on the device just by connecting it to my Linux box. And I could see the same AT commands that Brian observed over the board interface UART on my machine, in addition to the GPS coordinates that were being transmitted by the device. So our next steps, well, we'll keep on trying. It's getting more and more frequent that organizations are getting more intelligent about disabling interfaces that shouldn't be enabled, but we're going to keep looking for those sorts of things. We also need better tooling. So pogo pin adapters allow us to connect to those really tight 6-pin interfaces. Different programming adapters for different types of boards would be useful. And we're going to research other options for dumping flash from high pin count devices like BGAs. Any questions? So the question was, are there a lot of these devices, or are most companies using just one device? There are 77 different devices that are registered with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. So they're all approved to be used. It's really up to the carrier what they're most comfortable with and how much they want to pay. As we were looking at each of the devices, I only had one that actually charged me a per month fee. So that, that kind of begs the question, how much are they willing to invest in security if they're not charging their customers a recurring fee to maintain records and maintain the state of those devices?
All right. The question was, how much did they cost and what was our budget? As David was saying, about $50 to $150, depending on which one you get. Our budget, I don't know. I mean, we tried not to get too crazy. So we just each ordered a couple different devices and tried to keep it, fairly low.
So the boss doesn't know.
Yeah.
He knows now. So the question was whether or not we checked to see if the firmware was signed. In our case, we didn't end up getting firmware in our hands to look at, either from the devices or from the manufacturer. That device with the high pin count was probably the one that we would have been able to, but for the app to actually launch, you had to be paired with the device. So after we fried it, that was pretty much game over.
So the question was, what about local storage? Did any of them have local storage that we could access? So with some of those, it was, again, we desoldered the flash chips off of the boards, looked at them, and on the first one where it was just basically a bunch of garbage that, from what I could see the strings, I would assume that it was being used for some kind of a local storage mechanism, but we couldn't, in the time that we had, we couldn't really figure out anything with it. But it did appear that some of them had some kind of local storage. Okay, so the question was, did we find any Easter eggs in the firmware? As David mentioned, we didn't quite get to the firmware portion of it. We had pulled off some of the APKs so we grabbed down some of the applications that you put on your mobile device. On a rooted device, we started kind of playing around with the APKs, but we just kind of ran out of time, and we didn't really have time to look to see if they had anything interesting in them. So not that we found during the time we were testing.
So the question was, what was our time frame? I think I bought my first ELD back in May, and the one with the 65 exposed pins, the difficulty there is the more things you have to look at, the more you have to look at them. So it can take forever. And we were working up until Monday looking at these devices. Yes, this past Monday. So the question was, would there be any way to right block that interface onto the CAN bus or the 1939 interface? It's a two-pin differential signal. So I'm sending my ones and zeros with opposite polarity on 2 pins. And I send and receive across those 2 pins. So without software controls, there really isn't a physical way to restrict transmission onto the bus, because I don't have separate transmit and receive pins.
All right, yeah. All right, well, if there are no other questions, I want to thank everyone again. I think Mr. John Strand has a message.
Well, thank you guys. Round of applause.